I think we will see that we are live. All right, so greetings and welcome to another Educator Innovator Hangout on Air. It's May 19th, and today we have the opportunity to talk together about understanding and creating digital texts. So in the digital age, we're writing now more than ever, not only by using digital tools, but also by connecting to expansive audiences in digital spaces and constructing on and offline identities as authors, but also finding avenues to amplify our voices and to raise awareness about key issues. So we're excited to explore a number of different questions, but two broad questions that we're going to be thinking about in our conversation today build off of Richard Beach's book, Understanding and Creating Digital Texts, as well as Antero, Nicole, and Laura's work, and we'll introduce all of them in a moment. But the questions that we're going to wrestle with broadly together are, how can we help young people engage in practices that encourage them as they create digital text to define purpose and audience, and to make connections between digital text and people, and collaborate with others, and explore alternative modes of communication and gaining new perspectives. And we also want to think about, of course, how can we frame this work through a connected learning lens, and particularly thinking about civic engagement and political engagement in the digital age. So I'm your host, Erica Hodgen. I work with the Civic Engagement Research Group in Oakland, California. And I also work closely with the MacArthur Research Network on youth and participatory politics. And we have a group out of that research network that's thinking about how to support and learn alongside of educators about what does it mean to engage young people and also prepare young people for civic and political development and engagement in the digital age. And one of those projects is in Oakland, California. It's called the Educating for Democracy in the Digital Age. So we have a fabulous group of guests today. And I'm just going to briefly share who they are, and then I'll let folks introduce themselves in more detail. But we have Richard Beach, a professor emeritus of English education at the University of Minnesota. We have Antero Garcia, an assistant professor in the English department at Colorado State University. And Nicole Mira, who's a postdoc scholar at UCLA Graduate School of Education. And Laura Trail, who is an English and journalism teacher at Oakland High School in her 7th year of teaching. So I'm going to turn it over to you all to give us a brief introduction, and I think I'll start with Antero, who is on the very left of my screen. So Antero, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'll keep it brief. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to diving into this conversation and talking about everyone's work. Just a little bit about some of the, and I'll put some of these resources in the chat, I think. But I helped co-edit, or I edited the ebook, Teaching in the Connected Learning Classroom. It's a free book. Nicole was one of the chapter editors for it, that looks at what connected learning looks like presently within classrooms. So rather than theorizing that practice, we're trying to explore what teachers are already doing to help push the ways we understand practitioner life in classrooms. I'm spending a lot of time thinking through gameplay and what that means for both literacy construction and digital identity. So those are some other things I'm doing. Looking forward to talking with everyone.
Great, thanks, Antero. So Laura, let's turn it over to you.
Hi, I'm Laura Trail. Can you hear me? I teach 10th grade English at Oakland High School, as Erica said, and I'm in my 8th year, and I've been working this year with the Educating for Democracy in the Digital Age project to try to bring my students online more and to use online tools in a way that's different from what I've traditionally done in my teaching.
Great, and Nicole?
Hi, everyone. Prior to going to UCLA, I was a high school English teacher. I taught in both New York and Los Angeles, where I thought about these issues of digital media. I also had the opportunity to coordinate the UCLA Council of Youth Research, which is a project that Antero has also worked on with me in Los Angeles, led by Professors Ernest Morell and John Rogers, where we've helped young people research issues that they care about in their own schools and communities and use digital media to express their findings and to push for social justice and political change. So I'm excited to talk about that work. And I'm excited for the next step. I'll be moving this summer to El Paso, Texas, and starting as an assistant professor of English education at UTEP, where I'll be teaching courses to pre-service teachers about multimodal digital literacy. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Great. And then Richard.
Hello, everybody. I taught English education for many years at the University of Minnesota. And where in the final years of that experience, we're focusing much more on the digital aspects of teaching English, because that was certainly an obvious need in preparing teachers for the 21st century classroom. So I'll be talking a little bit about a book that we published just recently, the focus of some of our discussion. Also, I have recently published a book on the use of apps for teaching English.
Great, thank you all. So before we dive in, I wanted to just mention that if you're watching the Hangout from the Educator Innovator blog page, then we encourage you to jump into the chat room so that you'll be able to chat with other people who are also watching. And we'll be posting links and resources to that chat room throughout the webinar, and you can also post questions to us in that chat room as well. So in order to get us started and jump in, I'd like to ask Richard if you could share a little bit about the recent book that you mentioned, Understanding and Creating Digital Text. And if you could tell us a little bit about the central goals of the book and some of the key ideas that you learned as you were, investigating this kind of work in the classroom. And so Richard's going to share some slides with us to get us started.
Okay. Yeah, the book is called Understanding and Creating Digital Text, an activity-based approach. And I want to note my co-authors, Chris Anson, former chair of 4Cs, who was at North Carolina State University, Leanne Kassenbruce at University of Minnesota, and then Tom Reynolds. And we do have a handout. This has also been on the notice, but there is a handout related tools and apps that on which I put a lot of links, and if you are interested, I'll pull this up again, but it's tinyurl.com and Q3MMQX3. That's Q3MMQX3. And here is the book, and for the book we also have a website that has a lot of resources on it, and that's at digitalwriting.pbworks.com. So I think clearly there's a shift now to more digital literacies in the English classroom, shift away from print literacy being the primary focus to much more focus on various digital literacies. The question is, how do we foster that in the classroom? I think one key aspect of all this, and the focus of a lot of our book, has to do with how we're responding to both print and now digital text. Where often in the past it was the case that texts were static, they were fixed, they were monologic. Now digital texts are more and more dynamic, they're more open, they're more dialogic. And so there's a real shift in the nature of the text that we're working with. And I think a key aspect of this when we think about teaching writing is we also need to really focus on understanding text. The reading part of it is critical for creating writing, creating text. So that intersection between understanding and creating becomes important. And unfortunately, a lot of kids are just not doing a lot of reading. A recent study found that 15 to 19-year-olds, this is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, only spend 6 minutes a day reading. And so we need to really focus on the reading of digital text, which in a lot of ways is different from reading print text. For example, here is a wiki where students at the University of British Columbia were responding to a Monroe story that was put onto a wiki, and they were reading this text by adding little summary stories of their own to the wiki. So here's an example of reading a text, but then rewriting a text through reading the text and then writing the text. A lot of times students also are doing a lot of reading, but they're reading on sites like Rap Genius, where they're writing annotations. So they're reading about various rap lyrics, but then adding those annotations to those lyrics. A key focus of our book also has to do with the idea that it's not just the tools that are important that lead to activity. It's really the activity that teachers create that really use the tools to foster that activity. I think so much we often get caught up in what's the latest, greatest tool or app without thinking about the fact it's really what teachers are doing by using certain tools to foster digital reading and writing. And in the book, we talk about several affordances that are related to the whole aspect of use of digital reading and writing, one of which is contextualizing text. How can students see purpose and audience in thinking about reading and writing text? How are they using text to interact with others? How are they using it to make links? This gets back to the connected learning process where in text themselves they're constantly making links to other text. How are they collaborating with others? That's a key aspect of a lot of digital reading and writing. And then finally, how are they constructing their own identities in their writing in terms of adopting certain persona? So let me illustrate these different practices with two examples. The first example is from a school in Oakland where the 6th graders were studying climate change. And in this class, they were using mapping, they were using digital annotations, they were using VoiceThread, and they're using Google Docs. So for the mapping, one of the key concepts is what's the difference between weather versus climate. And so here they're creating a map such as this one, where they were sharing images, so we have multimodality. They were collaboratively working on these maps. But I think what's key here is the visual aspect of the use of mapping to understand, hey, weather is different from climate. They were also using Digo annotations, which I think is a wonderful tool for getting students to respond collaboratively to text. So they were reading a text like this. This is a description of the Mayalau Observatory in Hawaii, where they do a lot of work on climate change. And so the students would highlight the text and then add little sticky notes. And then they would respond to each other's sticky notes. And think of the mind of a 6th grader. The multimodality here, where they see the sticky note and they think, ooh, what's under that sticky note? Got to find out. So they pry open the sticky note, and then they read each other's comments, and then they engage in a discussion such as this one. So you see the discussion about the text. So we have reading the text and then writing the text, mediated by this interaction, this collaboration, mediated by Digo sticky notes. VoiceThread is certainly a very popular tool for responding to text, where students and adults can respond to the same text. So in this case, they were responding to each other's reading about climate change and then creating their own little VoiceThread productions. Here's one example where they were responding to the image of pollution, and here's another example of combustion being released by a factory. So they were sharing these, they were commenting about each other's, so you have interaction, you have hyper-interconnections, and so on. Here's another really interesting example. Here the student put up this image of the Ford Mustang, that sort of all-American rah-rah image, but then saying, wait a minute, this is a Mustang releasing combustion. So this student was engaged in critical inquiry about the whole issue of combustion, pollution, and climate change. And then finally what they did is the teachers had them write letters on Google Docs to Obama about the Keystone Pipeline. And so here's a case where Google Docs is a very useful tool for sharing drafts and commenting about each other's writing. So the students did a lot of interaction here. They revised their letters, and then the teacher sent them on to Obama. Not sure if these letters made the difference, but maybe they did. So we studied the revisions and drafts, and they did a lot of revision over time due to, I think, the feedback they were giving each other. And so here we have a case where you have tools that help each other in an instructional chain where the mapping in terms of what are concepts related to climate change, led to the DIGO in formulating arguments in thinking about different texts, to the voice thread where they're building their arguments, to the Google Docs. And so one important thing here is thinking about use of these tools is how do teachers relate them to each other? How do they make connections between them? So my final example is an example of an online role play at Jefferson High School here in Bloomington, Minnesota. And the students were really upset. And this is a case in point about sort of civic engagement, about the school was blocking access to their websites. They couldn't get to the websites they wanted to do their research. And so they were very upset about this, and so they engaged in an online role play where they used a Ning and they debated the issue, should the sites be blocked or unblocked? And so they were adopting different persona, key aspect of digital writing. They were sharing their arguments with each other. The students engaged in roles of being administrators, teachers, pro-con, students, and so on. And this went on for a couple of days. And then here is an example of the different roles they were playing, and they were seeing relationships with each other. So a lot of work in terms of rhetorical building of alliances with other people who thought and argued at their point. They created persona, such as emo girl. I think the internet usage policies are ridiculous. The policies are impossible to find. I spent a half hour trying to find them. I'm a young computer-savvy person. So here you have creation of identity through her image, the persona of emo girl, who was now engaged in this rhetorical effort. And what the students found is once they put their stuff together and then they wrote little papers and met with administration, the administration agreed to unblock the sites that they were being blocked. So here's a case where civic engagement paid off in their school. And one student noted, I'm realizing a few students working together to create change on a subject they feel passionate about can actually make a difference, whether it be in the school or in the community. So that's a few examples to illustrate the use of tools. Again, the handout that I have for this presentation has a lot of tools and apps. And you can, again, get that at tinyurl.com, Q3, MMQX3, as well as on the book's website. So that's a little summary of the book, and I'll turn things back over to Nicole.
Great. Thank you, Richard. That's a great summary. And I want to also just plug Richard's book for everyone who's watching and in the audience. I know we've all had the chance to read it, and it's a really fabulous book. And not only, I think, Richard, as you said, does it help us think about not just how to integrate digital tools, but how to integrate those tools in a way that is really promoting students' digital literacy development in the digital age, and also how to actively engage students in these sort of social purposes that help them think about how to collaborate with one another, how to understand and create digital text in that context. So your examples were fabulous, and I'd love to sort of kick it over to our other guests in the webinar to also share some other examples. So we have a sort of mix of people talking about ways that you yourself have either integrated this into your work or in ways that you have seen other educators integrate this work, and so embedding it in these sort of social practices. So can we start with, Laura, do you mind if we start with you?
No problem. Yeah, I enjoyed listening to that slideshow. It seemed really relevant to what I've been trying to do this year, which is trying to make the work that I have my students do online be more legitimately collaborative, because I definitely found myself doing some of what I was reading about in here in my early years of trying to have students put things online. I was just having them write the same dang essays, but put them on the internet for people to read, which doesn't actually feel like collaboration. I've found that using Google Drive has been an amazing tool for my students, because that way they can work collaboratively on the same document and I can be live editing, and that's been really helpful. But I've also been thinking a lot about the ways that my students use the Youth Voices website to talk to and work with students at other schools as well as within our school. And something that's been a sort of an eye-opener for me this year is realizing that I can give my students a whole lot more choice in what kinds of products they're creating. When they're creating something, say, for an audience online, if I know my goals are to have my students develop a strong thesis and to defend it with evidence and commentary, there are many, many modes in which they can demonstrate that skill. And so if I teach that in isolation in the classroom, I can push them to a wide range of tools that they can use to express those ideas in ways that will feel legitimate to them.
Laura, for folks that don't know, do you mind taking a minute to just say what Youth Voices is and a little bit of how you've used that platform for collaboration and also creating digital text?
Not at all. I'm still relatively new to Youth Voices, but it's a website that that is specifically for students across the United States, I believe. Are there international students as well? I don't know. Across the United States, there are a bunch of schools where students are using this site to share their writing and, in some cases, art and short videos, Google Hangouts, to communicate about ideas that are coming up in their school and in their work. And more than anything, what I've been realizing is that the site is really built around the idea of discussion, not just putting an idea out there for people to see, but around actually having a conversation. And some of the most successful posts and threads on, or discussions on Youth Voices seem to be the ones that start out with just sort of a brief introduction and a question, or a short discussion of something that's happening in our world right now, and again, that provocative question, and then sometimes dozens or even hundreds of people will respond. And yes, that is the link.
Yeah, so for folks that are listening, we're going to put the link to Youth Voices in the chat room so that you can see it. But this was a platform started by National Writing Project teachers in New York many years ago. And it is a site really created, as Laura said, for educators and students to engage and connect with each other around texts that they might be reading, around issues that they might be researching, and students can post about, you know, their perspectives, their ideas, their opinions, their writing, and then they have the ability to comment on one another's posts. And so, as Laura said, a lot of what you see on Youth Voices that's really, I think, compelling is the kind of back and forth between students. So it's a great example based on, you know, a lot of what Richard was talking about, where these digital tools enable these social practices in a much deeper and more meaningful way. So let's see if, Nicole, do you want to add some examples based on your own work in the classroom or other educators that you've worked with?
Sure, and I've been thinking a lot about what the benefits and challenges are of doing this kind of digitally connected work in classrooms and then doing them in more community grassroots spaces. I think I really had an experience doing this first with the Council of Youth Research, which is a university-school partnership where UCLA works with several schools within South and East Los Angeles and helps young people to develop their own multimedia research projects. That was obviously a unique space because we didn't have the constraints of curriculum and testing that we face in the classroom. Also, resource constraints were not as much of a problem because we were able to provide resources and technology for students who may not have had access otherwise. But I think the main thing we were thinking about in that case was how to help students express a political viewpoint and use digital media in order to disseminate a message and also to develop their own sense of political efficacy and their own sense of identity as developing citizens. So I think that there's something unique about, you know, we've heard so many reports about how the internet is making it easier for us to actually narrow the scope of political opinions that we hear because we can wind up just looking for news sources that confirm our own opinions as opposed to showing us different people's points of view. So we're really curious about how our students could actually provide a counter-narrative about what it means to be a young person of color living in Los Angeles, experiencing schooling as they do and experiencing society as they do, and really use media to speak back to power because one tweet is not necessarily more powerful than another. So what we worked on with our students was figuring out how, that old expression of the medium being the message, how to use the tools of digital documentaries, Twitter, blogging, in order to speak their minds and actually get into communication with fellow community members and people within the field. So, for example, when our students from Manual Arts High School wrote a blog about their experiences trying to do professional development for their teachers to show them what kind of curriculum and pedagogy they really wanted in their schools to be powerful, they actually had members of the community responding back to them on their blog and creating a conversation. So it was that kind of authentic learning that really motivated students and helped to give them a sense of power, that they could use the media to smash the patriarchy and to smash current systems of power. So I feel like that's really where we were that's where I really saw the power of that kind of technology. When I went back into the classroom after that experience, I know this might be for a different conversation, but the lack of resources made it a lot more difficult for us to use technology in the same way. It wasn't even about the curriculum or the standards so much, because we were able to work around those and be creative. But we literally had schools that were shutting down and blocking Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and other sites that can be used to create that sense of communication. So I think that's going to be a real issue moving forward for educators. There's a big fad of introducing technology into schools right now, especially here in Los Angeles, where we had a pretty infamous debacle around iPads. But a lot of that is around testing and not necessarily around how do we use this technology for critical and engaging pedagogy. So I think those are all issues that have been swirling around in my head of how to make this, what Dr. Beach was talking about, to make it more of a reality in more classrooms with more teachers.
Thank you, Nicole. And I would love to, after we, dive into some more of these examples, I'd love to sort of engage with that question that I think you just brought up around not only how do we make it equitable, but what do we do in contexts where there aren't the same kinds of access and resources? Because I think that is a real challenge. It's certainly something we've seen in Oakland. So thank you. So Antero, we'd love to hear about some examples from you.
Sure. First of all, I've really enjoyed hearing the examples from everyone else so far. I was struck thinking through the presentation Richard kind of kicked us off with, and particularly this idea that digital literacies are dynamic. And well, I guess one layer I would add to how we think about what's dynamic about digital literacies is the way we need to integrate culture and identity of the young people who are in our classrooms, and the ways those identities are mediated around digital literacies today. So I'll give a couple examples to help offer what I mean by that. And I'll say that in terms of digital literacies disrupting how we understand traditional literacies. So one is when I was doing some research with my colleague at UCLA, Thomas Phillip, we were looking at how young people are using mobile phones for different types of data collection, right? For them to do citizen scientist type of work. And one of the things they're doing was they're going to document all of the different kinds of times that they ate snacks throughout the day. It was going to be a snack app to tally whenever they ate a snack throughout the day. They would go on the app and do that. But one of the things we quickly found out is the idea of a snack is culturally mediated, right? So as a middle class teacher who had disposable income, I could very quickly buy a bag of chips, or I could go through the drive-thru and get something unhealthy, or I could pretend like I'm going to eat an apple later. Snacks were something that were very fluid to my lived experience, right? But for working class students at the schools we're working in inner city Los Angeles, a snack was equivalent to being a meal at the end of the day. And I think that's one of those things that is really important for us to consider, is how does digital literacy help illustrate for us as teachers, what counts as a snack, or what counts as how we understand the culture around us. And I think it was helpful in highlighting blind spots for me, digital literacy. I think that was an important piece for me to consider. A more relevant and more recent example, I've been working with pre-service teachers here in Colorado, and one of the things I've been doing is making my pre-service teachers blog, right? Just very simply go to WordPress or Blogger, wherever you want, make a free blog, and as part of your assignment for my class, in a very traditional way, you need to blog on your blog twice a week, right? And think through, what's your voice, what's your audience, what's your purpose, and do that through the lens of you are a future teacher, right? What is the purpose of the text you're producing, and how is commenting on other people's blogs, writing your own blog, pushing it out via Twitter, how are those all parts of the civic action of being a teacher in 2015, right? So thinking around issues of the Common Core, thinking around the ways things like the opt-out movement are being organized and mediated through digital tools. I want us to remember that civic media is a political tool not just for our students, but also for the teaching profession. So it's been interesting watching students think through that. I guess on the other hand of this, and kind of going back to Nicole reminding us to smash the patriarchy, I think about things like Gamergate, right, where you see huge negative influences of what's happening in online social media and how we respond to one another. And I think we also need to remember the tensions and the challenges of what happens in digital spaces too, just to start.
Thank you, Antero. I think, I would love to jump into one of those challenges that I think many of you touched on in some of the examples that you were sharing. I think one of the big challenges that we have seen in our research and kind of looking at how young people are using digital tools to engage civically and politically, I think that while the digital divide and young people's sort of access to tools is certainly a challenge, and we see that as a challenge in our schools, what kinds of technology or consistent technology that works do people have access to, or if young people have more access to mobile technology, how are they using that in ways to sort of get their voices out there, to read, to create text, to circulate things. But we're also seeing a lot of tension with schools blocking those kinds of tools. So I'd love to sort of think together about how are people responding to some of these challenges around access, and not just access to tools, but access to also being able to create technology. So one of the things that we're seeing in our research is that there is much more of an issue with a participation gap versus a sort of access to technology gap, where many more young people now have access to actual tools, but what those tools are able to do for them to not only create and circulate text might be more limited than some other young people. Or some young people, have a lot more access in school or in learning spaces outside of schools to learn the kind of skills and capacities to create digital text versus being consumers. So I'd love to think together about this challenge of equity, access, and not just in terms of the tools themselves, but in terms of creation and production. So any thoughts about how you've seen those challenges come up, or how you've seen educators address that?
Let me jump in on that one. I think the latest Pew data shows that 94% of adolescent students use their devices daily, and 90% of them use them of these students use them for texting, and they're sending and receiving 30 texts daily. Okay, so they're doing a lot of this texting, a lot of communication using their mobile devices. And then along comes, they walk into the school and say, oh, no, can't bring your tool into this classroom. So we have this sort of breakdown in terms of what they're doing outside of school versus in school. However, more and more schools are moving to BYOD policies where they can now use their devices in the school. The challenge then is, can schools have effective BYOD policies? Like, do they have adequate Wi-Fi access? You can have all these devices in the school, but if they don't have really strong broadband, that's a real problem. It's also important that staff know how to use these tools, the mobile tools, in terms of academic uses. So I think here we need to make somewhat of a distinction, although it's blurred, between the social, like I'm texting my friend, I'm checking my Facebook, and academic uses of these tools. So that's a tension that sometimes needs to be worked out. And I think some of this, we're seeing a lot more use of tools now for visual things. They can make videos with it. They can snap pictures. They can share those. They can readily use those to create really interesting text. And in the book, we talk about the use of, say, Storify to create these really multimodal essays using these mobile devices. So there's a lot of potential there if schools only work through some of these policy issues and really deal with the strong, good BYOD policies.
Yeah, and I would add, I think that I agree with Dr. Beach. I think schools are more and more going to be providing more access to devices or allowing students to bring their devices in the future. And I think it really is going to become more of a question of, you know, we keep hearing that term value added, that evil term around teacher evaluation, but I think it's really a time for a conversation in schools about what the value added is of how we use technology and for what reasons. Because I've seen technology used as little more than a different kind of word processing tool, in which case we're not getting much additional value, and it's not bringing us something that we couldn't get otherwise. And so I really feel like it goes back to what we were hearing about the idea of it being a dialogic medium, the way that it can force us to think about ways we talk to different types of audiences. So I think the next frontier is really going to be about teachers figuring out that participation angle and what it means to design assignments and then lead students through assignments that encourage them to communicate through digital media in ways that they could not do in any other form, and to really kind of take on what's unique and powerful about this medium. Because I feel like teachers are creative, and we will find ways to get technology into the hands of our students, whether we have to put in donors choose applications or beg, borrow, and steal, whatever we have to do, we can make the access happen, but it's really about what happens once we get the tools into their hands. And so I feel like I'm really excited about websites like the National Writing Project has their Digital kind of clearinghouse of lesson plans where teachers are teaching teachers and putting forth their best practices and sharing their work. And so I feel like it's really getting to that place where we can start having a conversation about what we want students to produce moving forward and to become global citizens, as opposed to simply test takers of the park and succeeding in college courses.
Yeah, I think building off of that, I think one of the concerns I've been thinking through with this idea of access and equity tied to it, right, as Nicole reminds us, is that ultimately I think we've got this inherently democratic platform of Twitter, and I realize that there's things like promoted tweets, and there's the filter bubble, and so we could problematize what democracy looks like in these digital platforms and who owns those and profits from them. But aside from that conversation, we have a space where people's voices and tweets matter on fairly equitable levels, right? That one person can tweet and create change in ways that others can as well. But at the same time, like when you bring that into schools, you're doing so essentially. This sense of democracy is at loggerheads with the kinds of top-down, undemocratic spaces of classrooms and schools and administration, right? And so I think those are two key issues for us to consider, and part of that has to do with teachers' possible discomfort or uncertainty with using tools that open up to the broader world. Part of them have to be with teachers not necessarily feeling comfortable with their own expertise with tools that students might be more familiar with, right? So something like Snapchat might not be something I want to use in my classroom. There might be other reasons for that as well. But it might be because of my expertise with a platform like that and what are the affordances of it within my classroom. I think about like Dana Boyd's work in her recent book, It's Complicated. She has a chapter that really looks at the expectations and assumptions that teachers made around Wikipedia and looking at when teachers trusted Wikipedia, when they didn't trust Wikipedia, and how those attitudes might have been cemented early on in the formation of what Wikipedia was and how that's changed over time. We can also, Carrie James has talked about ethics and identity with civic work in her book Disconnected. I think both of those offer some powerful resources for teachers to consider issues of access, equity, and democracy with digital literacy.
I feel like the others have brought up a lot of the things that I see in my classroom. I see my students really turning to their phones a lot of the time as their primary source of internet connection. And I've noticed definitely that in the last few years their phones are able to produce a lot more. I definitely heard what was being said earlier about them being able to produce less than they're able to consume through their phones, but I also feel that a lot of those mobile tools are getting stronger, and it's easier for students to make stuff that way. One of the things that I've found really helpful in my own teaching is just making students do everything online, saving all their work in the cloud in Google Drive or something like that so that they can access it anywhere, because their internet connectivity may be the school Wi-Fi, which thank goodness we now have functional school Wi-Fi that is accessible to the students, and I mean parts of it are blocked, but mostly it's not. And they're able to use school computers, they have access to library computers, many of them have computers at home. So between that, they may have many different ways that they're getting online, and the functionality may look different. I mean, if you've tried using Google Drive on a phone or like Google Docs on a phone, it's kind of a pain, but it works. And you can comment and do all the same stuff that you would do elsewhere. I brought it over the sign that I keep on my wall. I think that maybe what Nicole was saying made me think of this. I have the electronics code for my classroom. Oh, is this mirrored for you guys? Maybe. But it says off and out of sight, which is the official school policy, but frequently, say during a lecture, I'll bring up a question that I want the students to spend 5 minutes researching, and it's the kind of thing where, like out in the real world, I would expect my friends to pull out their phone and look up some stuff to discuss, and so I'll just flip it around to on as teacher instructs, and the students know that exactly how they can use their phones during this time. So it's still top down. I still get to tell them what to do, but they're learning, I hope, new or expanding the ways in which they're able to use their personal technology.
Just to follow up on Laura's point about the use of the cloud, I think the cloud is huge now. You have the new platform, the Google Classroom, which allows teachers and students to upload and share and do a lot of feedback to each other with docs, with slides, and so on. And now you've got tools for audio feedback built into Google, which I think allows teachers to do audio feedback, use of screencasting feedback, and so the whole aspect of digital writing has changed radically with these cloud-based tools, where forget the paper, no more paper, and now it's all in the cloud, and that makes it organizes things better. You have clear assignments, say on Google Classroom, and so this sharing and collaboration, as illustrated with the Google Docs letters they wrote to Obama, it fosters this sort of collaborative repository, this community of writers that you also see, of course, on Youth Voices, where it's this community. So it's a sense of communal expression of voices. And the more communal, I think, the more political. And so I think the cloud is sort of mediating this really exciting new development away from the single old essay that this teacher read, gave back a B+, and at the end of it. It's a different way of sharing knowledge.
I think that many of you have touched on these different ways that we can sort of expand how young people use these digital tools, not just for social purposes, but academic and civic purposes, to get their voices out there. And I think many of you also touched on something that we've been thinking a lot about in our work in Oakland with educators, but also in connecting with educators in Chicago and many other cities, that there is not only an excitement about using these digital tools and the ways that they expand the affordances and opportunities, but there are, of course, also risks and challenges of sort of navigating identity online, things that are put online stay online, and how does that stay with you? What's the digital afterlife of that? And I think that, there are also teachers come to this and educators come to this, as we all do, with a sort of varying level of comfort and familiarity. And even if, I were to learn Snapchat and many other tools, it doesn't mean that I could keep up with young people in the different ways that they're using all these things. So I would love to sort of think about this other challenge of how do we support educators to take on this work in expansive ways, but also doing it as opposed to like trying to use tools. And I think, Nicole, you said this as just kind of the mere kind of typing tool, right, that sort of replaces print literacy curriculum. And then of course we have these other really inspiring examples, but how do we, with educators, support them to do this in small ways and to take it one step at a time? And we found in some of our research in Oakland that there was a teacher survey where teachers across the district, 93% of them said that digital tools are key to education reform, but more than 60% said that they've received zero amount of professional development on using digital tools and thinking about digital literacy. So how do we think about this? I know this is something we've really struggled with, is how do we support teachers to do it in meaningful ways, but to also do it in manageable ways and to start small?
Yeah, I would say that before we expect classrooms to become flipped environments of blended learning, I think we really need to treat teachers as learners and give them the opportunity to engage in professional inquiry around using new tools, even just getting to the point of being able to brainstorm and share what tools a faculty knows about with each other, actually dedicating professional development time to discussing that would be extremely valuable. I know I didn't have the time to do that in faculty meetings, and it was only through informal conversations with colleagues where I was able to learn about maybe a new tool that I didn't know about, or to have a chance for educators to actually, like Mimi Ito talks about, hanging out, messing around, geeking out, actually giving teachers the time to do that kind of work before we were expected to then figure out how that translates into the classroom. I mean, teachers, if we want to see teachers as professional learners, we expect that they've had plenty of time to hone their reading and writing and listening and speaking skills in traditional media, but if we want teachers to then transition over, we need to give them the chance to experiment with those new forms, and then actually treat young people sometimes as facilitators, so it really helps to break down that power relationship between teachers and students. I don't have to feel like I know everything in the classroom. Obviously, I wouldn't feel comfortable introducing a lesson with a technology that I'm not comfortable with or that I don't know how to use, but I think there is something to be said about handing the reins of control over to young people sometimes to teach us about what they know and to let them ask us the questions about what they don't know and let that lead our planning and our curriculum. I think it could be a really powerful way to build trust in the classroom and a way to build relationships with young people to show that we don't always know and that we treat them as experts in what they do know. And then I think it's just about finding, one thing in a unit, like not feeling like teachers have to automatically switch over to full digital, curriculum and pedagogy and everything, but just giving one chance to kind of experiment with a tool that does something meaningful and add something to their curriculum that they hadn't known before could be the spark that really gets an educator motivated to learn more, and try something then twice in the next unit and slowly build their repertoire. And I think that could be a really powerful practice. And the only way we're going to get there is if there's a recognition of the pedagogical nature of these tools and not simply creating a Facebook page for a character in a book that no one's ever going to see and that is just to deal with the flash of the internet as opposed to actually using it for its democratic purposes.
Just a quick follow-up on that. I think I've seen a lot of teachers and they're coping with what you might call tool overload. There's all these tools out there, there's thousands of apps, and they feel overwhelmed. And so one thing I think is important that they figure out just a couple of key tools that work really well, and they get real comfortable with just those tools, and then they work with those particular tools with their students so their students get comfortable. And yeah, I like the idea too of students choosing their own tools. On the handout, I have an example of some OSSEO teachers here who created a thing called I Choose, where it's a heuristic where the students choose from 7 different tools, and they have to choose them, and the students make their own choices about what tools they're going to be using given certain topics like how are you going to use these tools, what purpose, what's the outcome, and so on. So I think, yeah, giving students choice, because they have to learn themselves. I'll choose a tool that's going to be useful, and they've got to learn to do that. And so this project, I think, really serves to foster that. I think the other thing is having a school, a shared repository of information where both teachers are sharing stuff, but they're also putting their students' work up. And so you have a central repository, a sort of professional learning community again, where they're sharing what they're doing in their classrooms, and the teachers can all put that stuff, and they all can see that on the same website. And so it's kind of like a professional development tool where it's a kind of shared community of ideas about how to use these tools.
I would jump in there. Well, I guess I am jumping in there. It's not even a would. It is. I have. And one, I want to go back to. I want to come back to the app question in a second. But I really appreciate Nicole bringing in Mimi Ito's work here and thinking through that part of the ways we use these apps as teachers and feel comfortable with them in our classrooms is through the sense of play, right? I think it's messy, and I think as teachers we're expected to be experts with something as soon as it comes into the classroom, and we need to. Again, I think it's about shifting power and democracy within classrooms to feel comfortable to play and explore with our students with these digital tools. And I wonder, in some kind of way, like where is that as we learn to write as kids, and you had that like beige, ugly dotted line paper, so you could practice that that print-based literacy. And I wonder what that beige dotted line paper is for digital literacy. Like where has that gone? And so I wonder if that's what we need to be thinking through. And I wonder if one of the ways we do that is coming back to Rick's presentation early on. I wonder if we need to focus on the affordances of different kinds of apps rather than on the individual ones in particular, because they go away, right? I think about the migration from Nings to Weebly's to Wikis, right, and from one place to another, right, and what happens when we get anchored to one specific tool and one specific resource. And I say that knowing that an entire curtain's going to open over the next couple of years around this idea of the Internet of Things, which is now a thing, right? So pretty soon, students are going to come to school and their shoelaces are going to be tied to the web, right? And their backpacks are going to be tied to their web, right? And that all sounds terrifying to me. But I think about, apps aren't going to be this thing that you look at a digital device for, right? They're going to be mediated through the clothes we wear and the utensils we use to eat lunch, right? It's going to all be tied to I think what we consider now digital literacies are going to be embodied literacies of what we are, and I think those are kind of the next steps of what we need to consider with the affordances of different tools.
So we have a little bit of time left. The time has gone by super fast, but I just want to see if anyone has any last thoughts or questions that you want to put out there generally before we start to wrap up.
Just a quick point about teachers, doing this themselves. One of the teachers in this book, who's Kristen Wallace, teaches at Westonka High School here in Minnesota, says this: after writing my own blog for a year, I had confidence to integrate blogging into my classroom. So I think the fact that she was using the blogging herself and got really comfortable with it, that then meant she was more comfortable using it in the classroom. So I think, and then students sense this. I mean, hey, my teacher's blogging, my teacher's creating digital video. So I think, having that experience of using these tools themselves really can be infectious for other students. And then the teachers get confident in sharing and using these tools and showing how they use them. Because it's really how they use them for certain purposes and audiences, as Troy Hicks has argued, that's really critical here.
And I would add also the when we were talking about the fear of kind of allowing young people to engage with the real world, when I go online and look for digital literacy, I'm always very troubled when I see websites that pop up that are all about or digital citizenship, but when you click on it, it's really just about kind of like scaring young people into staying away from strangers, but in the digital realm. And so I think there's a lot of, we're always trying to protect young people, and obviously schools have an important liability and need to make sure that what is communicated from schools is keeping students safe. But I think it's also not giving students a lot of credit for the kind of work that they're already doing, navigating the online world outside of the school time all the time. And so I think seeing them more as partners in this endeavor and using them as teachable moments within meaningful projects, as opposed to simply having them understand that every time you post something, it's going to stay on the internet. Do you want people to see what you posted? Do you want to be embarrassed? As opposed to that kind of bad version of character education. I think that it's important to move past that and have meaningful conversations about what it means to have a digital life and a digital identity. And I think those young people are excited to have those conversations, and that could really be a way in for teachers and students to begin building a relationship around this issue that I think could be really powerful and fun.
Yeah, I know, Nicole, I really appreciate that comment, because I do feel like often when, especially in talking about online dialogue, often the conversation quickly goes to online bullying versus, how do we engage young people in grappling with each other around difference in opinion, around multiple perspectives, and disagreeing with each other. How do we learn the skills to do that face-to-face, but also, be okay with, doing that online and learning the skills of doing that online as well. And I think one project that we've been working closely with is the Good Participation Project with Carrie James and Margaret Rundle at Project Zero, and one of the things they've been really looking at is not only how do young people engage in online dialogue, but also how does that impact their sense of their own identity and their sense of their own expression online. And one of the things that they've been doing and working with educators is it's not just about engaging young people around the tools themselves, but it's also engaging with them in discussion and reflection about, what does it mean to be online? What does it mean to express yourself online? What does it mean when you come up, against someone who is disagreeing with you, and how do you navigate that? And I think that those conversations are just as valuable or equally as valuable as using the tools themselves and engaging in sort of learning exercises with those tools. So I want to pause for a second and see if there's any last thoughts, any inspirational words anyone wants to leave us with in our last couple minutes. No pressure. Well, I want to thank all of you for being inspirational and for sharing not only the great work that you're doing, but also for sharing many of these challenges and many of these questions that I think we are all alongside of young people thinking about and really exploring. So I want to appreciate you for sharing about your practices and your reflections and thinking about this. Richard, I want to thank you for sharing the work of the book that you and your colleagues have just released. It's been a fabulous foundation for us to think about many of these issues, and I do encourage people to check out the book and, of course, the online wiki of resources that you shared with everyone. And I want to thank everybody for their time in joining us, and thank everyone for watching, and for those of you that are in the chat room. And I wanted to add a couple of last things before we sign off. That if you're interested in learning more about connected learning, which we touched on in various ways today, please check out the Connected Learning Alliance website, which is clalliance.org. And then, of course, if there are many resources and also ways to connect with other educators through the Educator Innovator Network. And so I encourage you, there are monthly newsletters, there are webinars like the one that we've had today on a regular basis. And so you can get more information at educatorinnovator.org, as well as through their Twitter handle at innovates_ed. And I think that's it, unless anyone wants to add any last announcements or links or resources before we jump off. Okay, great. All right, thank you, everyone. Wonderful to chat with you. And we will sign off now and say goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.